Hello, thank you for coming. My name is Adam Sigel. I am a writer, producer. I work in Hollywood. And essentially, my career has been one that has spanned between traditional media and television and film. I work in fictional writing as well as documentary. But early in my career, this new thing called the internet started to appear. So I started to do a lot of work in digital work. I started to do work in interactive. I started doing work in games. And in the course of my career, I began to sort of observe really a different kind of creation process. And that had to do with what I call storytelling in 4D, which essentially means I think about, in the traditional way, you think about writing or directing a story. In this new way, I think more about designing narrative experiences. And while this may not seem like a big difference for many people, because you're still sort of producing documents and you're working with media, it is a change in mindset for the creators of content, whether it be documentary, journalism, film, or entertainment, because the audience has changed, and therefore, in many ways, we need to be sort of relevant. We need to stay connected, as Damien explains. So today I'm going to sort of focus on a big component to this way of thinking, this narrative experience design, which is about immersive narratives. And so what there we go. Maybe? No? Do I do something wrong? Un momento. See? Another one? We switch it out? Oh, I need to do it though, with lots of things. Change that one out maybe with the other control.
I can.
It's too much. Yeah, no. See this one? Where did he go with the other? See? Okay, see if that works. Wait. I'll take that out, see if that one works. Okay, I think this is right. Excuse me? Okay. All right, so we're talking about immersive storytelling or immersive narratives. This is a very general idea. Obviously, the application is for virtual reality and alternate reality, or augmented reality. But I think this applies to many other aspects that are sort of in our world today in terms of design. What I want to do is just give us a definition. First of all, I think it's important to point out that this way of thinking, immersive narratives, this is not new. In many ways, this is what artists have been doing since the beginning of time. The idea has always been about transforming the audience or transporting the audience to kind of a new world with the story. So that's always sort of the key to it. So this isn't new, but what has changed is sort of all the new toys and technology around it. So let me just start with this definition. In an immersive narrative, we forget the real world. We live in we sort of live in a ludic space. In gaming, we talk about we enter this other place, but it's the idea to let our worries and our thoughts about the real world behind, and now we can kind of create a sort of a sense of a simulated life. It may be real in another context, it may be fantasy, but it's not ours. And then we have a kind of interweaving of both the mind, of how we think, as well as our body and the environment. And then finally, there's a conscious state of this engagement. We're very aware that we're not in reality. This is not to be confused with living a life where things are completely warped and twisted and it seems like you're in a weird kind of reality show, which is like living in the United States currently with our president. So I start by talking about where I see this really beginning, which is with the beginning of cinema itself. Cinema was really the beginning, in a sense, of a new type of art form because it brought together multiple types of elements. It brought together, first of all, when cinema began, the electric light was a fairly new invention. So it brought together this sort of electricity, lighting, photography, theater, and it brought it all together to create a more immersive sort of experience. But so what we see here is essentially an introduction of technology. The film here is the train arriving at the station, which is the Luminaire film, where, you know, all it was a train pulling into a station. And at the time, supposedly, people fled the theater. It was so real, they thought it was a real train coming in to kill them. This may not be true, but it's certainly a good story to tell. But I think the point being is it definitely felt immersive. It felt like this was really happening. And I think that speaks to what was happening technologically at the time. But when we talk about technology, what we find is that technology is the thing that's driving this type of storytelling. It drives the medium because it keeps introducing new ideas which extend and maybe make sort of a more firm or more concrete this notion of a simulated experience, makes it more real. It adds dimension to it. This happened when we introduced color to cinema, when we introduced sound, when we introduced 3D. The technology keeps changing, and with that comes a change in the audience behavior. So what we find is that on the one hand, you have the technology that's driving the medium, and on the other hand, you have the audience behavior. And that's what really depends on how these things come together. At one point, cinema had smellorama. Does anyone know it? Ever heard of that? Where literally they introduced smells into the theater, so you really felt like you were smelling what was happening. That didn't work so well. So the audience didn't respond, and that sort of technology went away. It's still possible, but no one uses it. So we have this relationship between the technology and what's driving it and the audience behavior and how they respond to it, how they incorporate it. And these two things then lead to a kind of evolution. Oops, didn't mean to do that. So this evolution basically meant that once you did the train pulling into the station a couple of times, it doesn't work anymore. Just like with virtual reality, when it started coming out, it was all cool and fancy and everyone was all excited, and then it got boring. So you needed to introduce something. And in fact, what you really needed to do was to go back to what is probably the most important component in an immersive narrative. It's the story. Telling the great story is one of the most important aspects of an immersive experience. It goes back to when we told stories around the fire. You create it. If the story is so compelling, you're there. And this is what essential to sort of most art forms, certainly in terms of cinema and in terms of any type of media. The story is the driving sort of immersive element. And it primarily works by creating empathy, by using empathy that you have in the characters and people within that world that you can then relate to. That type of experience creates in our minds and in our sort of, understanding of our cognition a sense of immersion. And one of the masters of this was this guy. I hope you know who this is. I'm always worried I come to have a lecture and no one knows who this is. This is truly one of the great auteur filmmakers in cinema, Alfred Hitchcock. And he believed, and he was very good at, using this story immersive component, this empathy. And what he did, though, primarily, was he focused on sort of three very primal core emotions or experiences of humanity, which is anxiety, chaos, and guilt. These are things that drive everyone. This is what is like in our heart. This is the fear. This is what is haunting us almost every single minute of every single day. And he knew it. And what he loved to do was sort of create characters that would exhibit these emotions and manifest this for the audience, so we suddenly related and understood what this person we're watching goes through. So what he did was create a subjective identification. So the immersive experience comes when we now take our experience and put it through the eyes, or see it through the eyes, of the character we're watching on the screen. So now, in 1960, Alfred Hitchcock had reached the zenith of his career. He had literally made films that were the Alfred Hitchcock film. He was really at the top of his game. And of course, as any great filmmaker would be, he was terrified. That's like right before you die. He didn't want to die. He wanted to keep going. But the problem was, there was all these new technologies that were emerging. Television. In fact, many people knew Hitchcock more from his television show than from all of his great movies. So he wanted to do a movie that really changed things. So he finds a book about a serial killer. And he's going to make this his next movie. And everyone around him said, don't do that. That's a really bad idea. But he's going to do it anyway. And the problem with this book is that it doesn't, in the first part of the book, the first act, it doesn't create that subjective identification. It doesn't create that immersive connection that the audience would have with the character. So we had to create it, because without that, none of it works. It won't happen. And so, and what you do in these moments is, and what he would want to do is, he creates this suspension and tension for the audience so that they're living through it. So in Psycho, what he did was he tells the story of Marion Crane. Now, we first see Marion in the opening shot we're peering into the window, and we find her in a state of undress. It's the middle of the afternoon. She's just had sex. Having sex is obviously, she's guilty. And not only is she having sex, she's not married, and she's having sex with a married man. So this is already putting us in a position where, I don't know, I'm feeling very guilty and a lot of anxiety right to begin with. What we then watch is Marion go from this romantic interlude back to her office, where she works at a real estate broker. In that moment, a wealthy man walks in holding a big wad of cash, and he's flipping it around and saying, I got a lot of money. Anytime someone walks around with a big wad of money, I don't know about you, I start getting a little anxious. I get a little nervous, like I don't know what this is not really the right thing to do. At this moment, the boss tells Marion, you know what, let's take that money and put it in the bank, because this is getting everyone a little bit nervous. So she says, okay, yeah, I'll take the money, and I'm also not feeling very well. What Marion decides to do, she's going to take that money, she's going to steal it, she's going to run away with her boyfriend so he can get a divorce, and then they can live happily ever after, feeling guilty and anxious and living in chaos their whole life. So she does that, and of course, as she's driving out of town even, who does she run into? Her boss, walking down the street, who looks at her, he's like, oh, hi, Marion, and he goes, weren't you sick? Anyway, she drives off, and then she keeps driving. And she's hearing the thoughts of what she's done, echoing in her head over, like the money that she's stolen. She's driving, she's getting tired, she falls asleep. Next thing, she wakes up, knock, knock, knock. The two dark, brooding eyes of a police officer are staring at her. And he's also staring at you, because every single person in this theater is also guilty. And so he caught her. And she starts panicking. She talks her way out of it. She goes. She tries to sell the car. And she trades for a new car. She's pulling the luggage out. It's falling all over the place. Chaos is all around her. She's in hell. And what does she do? She keeps driving. And she's driving, and then it starts to rain. And then literally the chaos is pouring down on her to the point that she loses her way. She goes off the main road. It's dark. She's lost. And then there's a hotel, a light in the distance. She's going to pull over for the night. And she meets the guy who runs the hotel. He's a little bit weird. He's got a strange, kind of overbearing mother, like we all do. And in that moment, when she's eating a sandwich, sitting with this guy in his office, he's got all these weird stuffed birds everywhere, she has a moment of clarity. I don't want to live guilty. I don't want to live with chaos. I don't want to constantly feel anxious. I'm going to go back to Phoenix, I'm going to return the money, and we're going to restore order to this world. I'm feeling much better. And I don't know about you, but after all that tension and suspense, I like a nice shower. Okay, I'm not going to show you any more of that scene. If anyone knows, if you've seen this film, and if you haven't, that scene is probably one of the most important, one of the most spectacular scenes in cinema ever. And it's not only how it's shot and how extraordinary it is, but it's about what I just described. It's that entire experience that you've gone through in the drive of a car with Marion on that way to that hotel, into that bathroom, into that shower. Now, you have to understand what's happening in 1960. See, in 1960, people are used to watching television. They don't come to movies anymore on time. They show up halfway through the movie. Then they watch it to the end, and then they wait and watch the first half. If you do that with Psycho, it's not going to work. It will ruin the movie. So Hitchcock has a problem. He has to now get people to come to the theater. He has to deal with this impact of television. He has to get people to suddenly come to the theater on time and, in a sense, really change the behavior that has now been established over the last couple of years. So he needs to start thinking beyond just the film. He needs to start thinking about an experience. And so he does this. I think this sound's working, but not sure. I don't think the sound's working. Is the sound up? Let me see here. Why isn't the sound working? Ah, there we go. Okay. So this is what he does.
This is Alfred Hitchcock. Having lived with Psycho since it was a gleam in my camera's eye, I now exercise my parental rights in revealing a number of significant facts about this slightly extraordinary entertainment.
This is a press book on film, an advanced press book to present to you a visual story on the care and handling of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. The scene is the DeMille Theater in New York. The entire motion picture industry knows that Psycho is being exhibited with a special presentation policy, a creation of Paramount Pictures showmanship. The man in the tuxedo is Nick Justin of the DeMille Theater. He is a theater manager. He is the main instrument of the policy. Listen now to the heart of the policy.
I've suggested that Psycho be seen from the beginning. In fact, this is more than a suggestion. It is required.
And here is what Broadway saw. No one, but no one, will be admitted to the theater after the start of each performance of Psycho. The audience had been sold this concept. With it, they were sold on Psycho. Mr. Hitchcock tells you, as he told them, why.
This, of course, is to help you enjoy Psycho more. We really have only your enjoyment in mind.
The campaign began with newspaper teaser ads calling attention to explaining, selling the policy. The keep the story a secret idea supplemented the policy. Special Hitchcock ads, well in advance, announced why it was desirable to see Psycho from the beginning. Close to opening day, another Hitchcock ad told why it was required and clearly supplied the audience with the time schedule of Psycho performances, as did every display ad before Psycho opened. The directory ads, after opening, confirmed the Psycho policy, gave the show times clearly. When they came to the theater, the audience saw Hitchcock in person. Well, not really. But with him there was a real live Pinkerton policeman to emphasize the policy story which the newspaper ads had pre-sold. We won't allow you to cheat yourself. You must see Psycho from the beginning to end to enjoy it fully. Therefore, do not expect to be admitted into the theater after the start of each performance of the picture. We say no one, and we mean no one. Not even the manager's brother, the President of the United States, or the Queen of England. God bless her.
So what's going on there is more than just kind of a gimmick, or even just really an advisory. What Hitchcock is doing is he's doing not what I just described in the first act of his movie. He's now expanding that experience to before you even see the movie, when you're waiting to see the movie. Because what does he do? When he was making the movie, he instructed that everyone in the cast took an oath. You're not allowed to violate the oath. If you do, you're guilty. So all of a sudden, everyone's on edge. And he went around, and when you watch the movie, even in the advertisements of the movie, there's a secret. You can't tell the ending. You're now suddenly put under suspicion. If anyone finds out about this movie, it's your fault. What does he also do? He starts to, and he has to sort of sell this to sort of all the theater owners. Now, the theater owners are thinking, we barely get an audience now anyway. Now we have to tell them they have to wait. But Hitchcock does it so well and in such a well-crafted way, the audience will enjoy this experience, even though he's now put security guards in the theaters. Why? Because at any moment, chaos can break out. People could start panicking because it's that dangerous. And of course, what are you doing? You're waiting in line. You're waiting in line to see something that's really dangerous and unexpected and scary. And that just creates even more anxiety. Also, interestingly enough, when you have to wait in line, they all have to wait in line. These lines went down the block, and in many cases, crossed the street and went to the next block, and that created the first blockbuster. This was incredibly successful, needless to say. And what it showed was, and I hope has helped people, particularly in this day and age, is that even someone as revered as Hitchcock is thinking more than just the film, is thinking about this experience. And not just, the minute the movie starts, it's the experience before the movie, during the movie, and after. Because that's really, and even so now with our devices, it's even more relevant today. So let's talk about, now as a writer, I approach sort of how this, I talk to you as a writer and how I see this. These are not hard and fast rules. I call them an aesthetic. These are things you can observe with immersive narratives. And there are sort of 4 areas that I sort of hit on. There are more maybe, but these are sort of the 4 big ones for me. They look at the aesthetic of space, the aesthetic of fragmentation, of participation, and of story worlds. So let's look at this notion of space. Obviously, space isn't new, but and in fact, when you look at genres, particularly genres like westerns and science fiction, the environment, the space, actually told part of the story. So looking at the landscape, looking at these things, these have always had this sort of powerful and emotional sort of storytelling component. And if anyone here works in the gaming industry, they will tell you there's a lot of work put in developing the environments in video games, because in many ways it's one of the most important storytelling components in a video game. What happens is that over a period of time, the player discovers pieces of things, objects, information, and that is how they begin to understand. That's their relationship to the story. And this is very much true in immersive narratives in general. And what I think is exciting about these, particularly virtual reality and augmented reality, is there is now a greater emphasis now and an exploration around space and how to look at it and how to start to play with these ideas. The next sort of key sort of component, aesthetic, is fragmentation. Now, this is, again, and it draws a little bit from games. There's a sort of common game mechanic where basically you're getting pieces of things over the course of time. And that is how you're sort of told the story. What this does is it creates a sense of mystery. It's like a detective story where you're getting clues, and these things you're piecing together. It creates a sense of mystery. So that's something that's very useful in the storytelling. But what it also does is when, particularly in an interactive piece, in something or a game where the user or the viewer is now actively picking these things up, they're now participating in the plot. And there's this sort of sense of agency and interactivity. And the danger that this also brings is that with fragmentation, when your story is all over the place and it can be discovered out of order, it can be overcomplicated. You can lose people. You see an effect with certain games or certain types of interactive projects where people bounce. They're not in, I can't figure this out. I'm done. I'll move on. So it's vital when you're thinking about this type of immersive content and you're using fragmentation to have a very clearly defined strategy, to really understand, and this is where the design thinking comes in, how people are going to understand and put this together. Now, this is a very lengthy sort of idea and way of thinking. I will give you two sort of large ideas to think about when dealing with fragmentation. One is this notion of a fractal. So if anyone doesn't know, the fractal is essentially a split or a piece of a thing that's whole, but that little piece represents or is similar to the whole. So it reflects it, it looks like it. And you get this kind of almost mirror or smaller mini-me of what your larger thing is. Now, as a writer, people who write fictional stories and scripts, this is very similar to how you construct subplots. Generally speaking, the subplot of any movie or story mirrors or counters the main plot that you're talking about. So what this does is a way to kind of reinforce and hold central ideas and themes that you're trying to convey. And this is useful in fragmentation because therefore, if people find a piece of something, they'll keep understanding, okay, now I get what you're talking about. That will create this sort of sense of unity in a fragmented space. The other sort of concept to think about is facet. So we think of facets, it's like pieces of a diamond. These are all separate, individual, unique sides to this larger piece. But each one has a distinct purpose, and they may or may not be connected to each other. So you may discover this piece, you may discover that piece, and each one in and of itself is interesting. Oh, I like it, I'll follow it, but I don't have to see everything. But one thing it does do is it does reinforce a central idea or a brand of the larger sort of piece. And this is very common, as we know, in franchises. So when we think of like Marvel, you see a lot of different Marvel movies, and sometimes they connect, a lot of times they don't, but you have a good understanding of a Marvel brand experience. And again, this is how you use the facet concept of fragmentation, where all of it may be not connecting or connecting, but it all speaks to this larger brand idea of what the franchise represents. Third aesthetic that I look at is participation. This gets back to this notion of an interactive or agency, where the user becomes involved in the story. Now, this quote here, I'll read it in case you can't, is from Henry Jenkins. It says, "Fans are the most active segment of the media audience, ones that refuse to simply accept what they are given, but rather insists on the right to become full participants." So what we've noticed, and Jenkins calls it participatory culture, it is almost fundamentally been driven by fans. And so have you heard of Comic-Con? Has anyone heard of Comic-Con? Right? Except for the Americans. But yeah, so fan cons, this notion of fans coming together to embrace their stories. They love it. And when I started in this business, I was told, stay away from the fans, they're crazy. And I thought, no, I love fans. Fans are wonderful. I'm working, particularly I do a lot of science fiction. Fans are great. They are crazy, but they're fun. And you have to embrace them, because what you find is they not only want to consume, and they consume a lot, but we're seeing now, particularly on YouTube, you'll see this, the fans now, the consumers, also want to be creators. And they start to become what we call prosumers. So what this means in terms of an immersive narrative is that you have a sense, if you're using participation, that the story that you're telling is everywhere, and that it's evergreen, it keeps going. Look at Harry Potter. My daughter watches YouTube stories about Harry Potter, and it's never ending. It's like it's all over the place. And if you noticed, Harry Potter is no longer a person. Harry Potter is now the wizarding world. It is now a world. It's much more of a brand. And it is driven a lot by the fans, and then it pervades in every aspect of your life. So this gives this sense of connecting and being part of your life, which is this immersive experience in a very real way. So it's incumbent, I believe, on creators, on journalists, on storytellers, whoever you are, if you're working in media, find a way to get the audience, to get the participants to join the action. Now, there's different types of action. There's different types of participation. There are very active participants, and there are less active participants. That's okay. Even if there's only a small number of participants, in fact, like in social media, what we find is only 10% of people on social media are really active on it. 90% are lurking. They like to watch. And in fact, there is this great interest among people to watch people, especially when they engage in these big franchises, people dressing up, cosplay, LARPing, all of these things. Even if you don't do it, maybe you think it's a little bit odd, but you may like to watch it. And I think what we start to realize is that this participatory culture doesn't always mean you have to participate. It's something, again, about creating this immersive world or this immersive experience around it. So I won't go into too much detail on this. I just want to tell you a little bit about how Jenkins and his colleagues talk about participatory culture. They talk about it having a low barriers of entry. So when you're creating this environment, you're creating this opportunity to engage, don't make it so hard. If it's too hard, you're going to lose your audience, right? You want to have opportunities for sharing. And now with social media, everybody likes to share. There's a lot of opportunities for sharing. There is this sort of almost a trope, if you will, in participatory culture where there is a training or a kind of passing of knowledge from a mentor to the participant. And then that participant does what becomes involved. But they only really will get involved if they feel like what they're doing is meaningful. So that participation has to mean something. It's not just, hey, do something and we don't care and it gets thrown away. No, audiences, participants know that. They want to feel like what they're doing means something. And then finally, it's really about the social connection. It's really about connecting with other people. And that is a huge part of the participatory culture, and what we ultimately find is it really is what makes the feeling, the sense of immersion complete. So finally, I want to talk about this aesthetic of story world. Now, because literally, in a sense, when you're making an immersive narrative, you're creating a world. And creating a story world is something that's born, well, it's born out of this notion when they used to say in Hollywood, when it began, you'd go into a producer's office or a studio head's office and they'd say, the most important thing is the plot, a good story. And that's true. But then movies started to make sequels. And then we had television, where it was the plot, but you would keep coming back to the same characters. The characters also became very important. So you had plot, you had characters, and now you're entering an experience. You need a world. So let me just briefly, and again, this could be its own lecture on its own, but it's story worlds I break down into sort of three areas. The first would be topos, the setting. This is literally the physical, the landscape, the environment. It can be, it's sort of the age or the place and time that the story is set in, often looking at how technology is used, just to give a sense so that the audience understands how they can relate to this world. The second is mythology, the mythos. This is the backstory of your characters, of how we got here. This very much is sort of a timeline and a chronology. Again, this doesn't have to be extended. This doesn't have to be 1,000 pages, unless you're Tolkien or something and you need several thousand pages to tell your story. But another important ingredient in mythology is understanding archetypes. This is particularly true when you look at genre, and I think it's true when people are not coming and looking at your material for the first, that's not the first thing they've ever seen. They're coming at it from a life of experience of seeing things that are like it. So there are archetypes in their head. There are archetypes, maybe, Jung says there are unconscious archetypes. It's important to understand the archetypes within your mythology so that you know how the audience will understand and relate to them and see the characters in the world through it. And then finally, there's ethos and character. This I find, as a writer, probably the most interesting piece, because this is really about the morality. This is about the values. This is about understanding the ethical sort of place of your characters. And it very much shapes in which the perception that the audience will see it. And it mostly, really, I think, determines what makes a great story and an okay story. This notion here, the center of good, is a writer notion where when you write a villain, you can't write a villain who's evil. No one's evil. No one wants to be. No one thinks they're evil. Everyone thinks they're good. Everyone thinks they're doing the good thing. But in their mind, in how they perceive the world, Walter White in Breaking Bad had a very clear center of good. He was trying to help his family. But over time, we began to see how this center of good was very twisted. And we became more and more distant from him. That's great narrative. And again, that gets you back into this empathy, understanding of storytelling, bringing you in the immersive experience. So understanding the center of good, understanding the ethos is crucial. So I want to get into sort of a little bit of the specifics here around the sort of the talk of the day between virtual reality and augmented reality. I look at virtual reality in two ways. One is a sort of a 360 film model, where you can look around, you have the option to sort of see what you want to see, but you can't necessarily interact. And the second is this responsive VR, where you literally are directly involved in changing and interacting the piece. To be quite clear about this, 360 films are a lot easier to make than responsive VR. Responsive VR have some sort of difficulties, and obviously because of the interactivity. With augmented reality, I like to think of it this way. Your real world, your actual physical world is your setting. It's your real environment, but now what you're doing is you're adding layers. You're seeing layers on top of that environment. This is very useful in location-based games. like Pokemon Go or any of the number of games that are sort of popping up. Also for geolocation and geofencing, which is really relevant when we're looking at new technologies being used in museums or in historical landmarks. Now, when you walk through a museum, you walk through a historical site, you can use augmented reality that can fill in and give you a deeper, more sort of involved understanding, a greater immersive experience around it. These are really cool, very interesting tools. I love to work in them, but as you find out, if you're coming from a traditional film and television background, the language of film doesn't really apply anymore. These are sort of the classic ideas, right? We think of film in terms of the classical techniques of angle or zoom or close-up or cutting and editing. This is how you create this emotional experience. This doesn't quite work in VR in particular. It doesn't work in AR either. So what you need to do when you're creating and thinking about this type of narrative is use another classical technique. Think about theater. How does theater convey these ideas? They use blocking. They use lighting. They use reactions. They use sound. Because remember, your audience now has an agency. They can look at what they want to look at. So you direct them, you tip them off, you guide them like you would in a piece of theater. Another important sort of component to understand, which people who come from graphic design definitely understand, is these are designed. It's much more of a design sort of technique, and the language and the way of thinking about it is very oriented around design. So we start thinking of navigation. We start thinking of user experience or user interactivity. Again, you think about how do you cue the audience? How does it flow? When I'm working in this space, sometimes I'm a writer, but they call me a content strategist. I'm thinking of the strategy of how is content given out? How does it flow? It's very much, again, from a design perspective rather than sort of simply just the storytelling. And finally, it's really critical in this design phase to understand the amount of user control. Obviously, with agency, particularly with games, you want to give the user as much feeling of control as you can, but remember, there are limits. You can't do certain things. And this is where I get to the point where I talk about there are some dangers lurking down this path. So if you really want to go out and make a cool VR video game, I wish you luck, but you may have some problems. As I like to paraphrase my good friend P. Diddy, mo immersion, mo problems. What we find with VR in particular is this locomotion, this problem with locomotion. We have an eyes and we have an inner ear. And generally these things have to match. If you're seeing something, but your inner ear is experiencing something different, that's when we start to get nauseous. That's when we start to get dizzy. That's where you start seeing people who take off the VR glasses and go into another immersive experience in the bathroom. It is not necessarily the one you've designed. So it becomes this challenge. It's a design question. So when you've got to figure out a way to match this feeling, this movement of your body with what you're seeing. So there are these contraptions. They look like they're out of the Inquisition, right? You've got these different things that you're holding on to. This is fairly elaborate. This isn't something you can just necessarily have at home unless you're a super geek. So there are some techniques that they developed. In a game you can port. You can do this other thing where you're sort of like jumping or you're swinging your arms. There's a new technology where they put you kind of in a backpack and it pushes you and it does this kind of thing to you as you're moving with the story so that you feel like you're really there, right? You feel like you're moving. Whatever you do, and I worked on a VR game and we had to basically remove a lot of agency, a lot of user control. And if you work in video games, that's a big problem. So one of the things I discovered is that virtual reality is not necessarily a video game platform. It removes a lot of agency from the player and therefore has other applications, but it may not necessarily be a video game one, even though it seems that was who it was designed for. For augmented reality, augmented reality seems great, okay, and it's really fun. You've got your Pokemon Go, and you're finding the character, and you're looking, and next thing you know, so there's a problem here. Okay, we're having people walking into streets, looking for their Pokemon guy, and next thing you know, they get killed. That's a little too much reality, right? So this again is a design issue. This is again thinking about space. This is again stuff that you start to work on. And again, once we start to sort of understand these things and really learn the challenges, the limitations, the rules, we'll understand it better. I think the most important thing that I want to leave you with is this notion, as I sort of started with, which is our technology is taking us to this place. And all of this media is being driven by the technology, our devices and what we're doing. But there's this other thing that's happening. There's this audience response, this audience behavior. And these things have to be connected. We have to understand this response. It's important to note it is no longer just, people making films. Like Francis Ford Coppola once said, he loved being a film director because it's the last place in the Western world you can be a dictator. Okay? Well, it's not anymore. It's much more democratic. You're going to have to now think, how do I create this conversation, a back and forth? How do I allow this? And what this does is it creates new opportunities. It creates more immersion and really allows a kind of, I think, expansion of the art form. And with that, thank you.
Bravo. Un aplauso para Adam. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.